Chapter 1. The Hunt for a Myth. Site 47, Pacific Ocean, SCP Foundation Containment Zone. The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast and uncaring abyss swallowing the sky's last slivers of light. The horizon bled into itself, the air thick with salt and silence. Beneath these waters lay something impossible, something that should not be. The SCP Foundation had monitored SCP-169 for centuries, though monitoring was a generous term. There was no way to track a creature the size of a continent, no way to observe a being that may not even be alive in the way humanity understood life. Some believed SCP-169 was nothing more than a myth, a phantom of old nautical terror buried beneath the waves. Others believed it was simply waiting. The O5 Council did not care for theories. They wanted answers, and answers required action. The mission begins. Beneath the Foundation's concealed sea base Site 47, the FCS Harbinger loomed in dry dock. Its hull reinforced with an experimental alloy, its frame designed to withstand pressures even the Mariana Trench could not boast. The Harbinger was no ordinary vessel. It was a harpooner of impossible scale, built not to sail, but to hunt. Inside the ship's dimly lit command deck, a dozen individuals stood in silence as a crimson warning light flickered over them, a pulsing heartbeat of tension. Dr. Elijah Voss, lead anomaly researcher, tightened his grip on the railing. He was a man of science first, a Foundation loyalist second, and an obsessive last. His mind churned through the logistics of what they were about to attempt. There was no precedent for this, no records, no proof that they would return. Across from him, Captain Michael Kessler, a former naval officer now reduced to a ghost of his former self, loaded his pistol with mechanical precision. He had fought anomalies before. He had seen things beyond human comprehension, things that left men broken and crying in the dark. Kessler had no delusions of success. He was a man given a suicide mission dressed in protocol. "We launch in 20, he muttered, snapping the chamber closed. "If any of you aren't ready, now's your last chance." No one spoke. No one laughed. The crew of the Harbinger was not here by choice. They were mercenaries, specialists, and researchers, pulled from the darkest corners of the Foundation's files, those willing to go places where the world refused to look. Cargo hold. The weapons of a doomed hunt. Down below, engineers worked feverishly to load the harpoons. These were no ordinary weapons. Each was a 40-foot-long projectile, lined with microfilament explosives designed to detonate inside the target. The neurotoxin payloads inside could liquefy a blue whale in seconds. Would it work against SCP-169? That question remained unanswered. Along the walls, dozens of submersible drones were checked for functionality. Abyss-class surveyors, designed for deep ocean tracking. Their sonar could penetrate 4 miles of solid rock, yet Foundation data showed nothing below the seafloor, where SCP-169 was said to lie. There was no heartbeat, no temperature fluctuations, no movements. This was either the largest corpse in existence, or something far worse. Deployment. Into the abyss. The ship's floodgates opened with a deep mechanical groan. The ocean roared as the pressure rushed into the Harbinger's launch bay, swallowing the massive whaling vessel whole. Hundreds of tons of metal trembled as the sea claimed them, the ship tilting downward as it was pulled into the unknown. Inside the control deck, the lights dimmed to combat the abyssal gloom pressing against the reinforced windows. The radar screen flickered with static. "Entering the black zone," the navigator reported. Site 47 had warned them about this place, an area of the ocean where all previous tracking attempts had failed, where submarines disappeared without a trace, where signals were absorbed rather than lost. Kessler stared at the nothingness ahead. "Keep her steady," he ordered. "Deploy the drones." From the lower deck, the Abyss-class drones launched in succession, their blue beacons blinking in unison as they vanished into the dark. Their sonar pulses rang out like a heartbeat, scanning the unfathomable depths below. Silence. Then, a return signal. Something was there. Voss rushed to the monitors, his breath catching. The data was wrong. It didn't make sense. The sonar was picking up a mass larger than the Mariana Trench itself, yet it was not solid. It was a void in the shape of something colossal. A shadow without a body. Kessler's grip tightened on the rail. Increased scanning depth. The moment the order was given, the ship lurched. A deep, impossible vibration trembled through the hull. Not an impact, not a current, but something below them. The crew felt it in their bones, a resonance that did not belong to this world. The Harbinger's lights flickered, the drone signals cut out, one by one. Then something moved. Not in the way a fish moves, not in the way a whale drifts through the dark. This was an entire section of the ocean floor tilting. This was a landmass exhaling. The depth gauge spiked violently, reading incomprehensible numbers. The water around them was no longer water. The ship's systems failed simultaneously. Radar, sonar, communications all died in a burst of static. Then, over the speakers, came the first and only transmission from their lost drones. Not land. Not dead. Eyes watching. The message cut out, replaced with a single, low sound. A pulse. A heartbeat too slow to belong to anything natural. And then, silence. Kessler turned to Voss. "Is it awake?" Voss did not answer. He could not answer, because for the first time in Foundation history, something was looking back at them. Chapter 2. The Black Zone. Nowhere on any map the Pacific Ocean. The FCS Harbinger glided over the abyss, its reinforced hull groaning against the pressure of the deep. It was a ghost ship in a lifeless sea, a metallic coffin plunging into a part of the world that did not exist. This was the Black Zone, a stretch of the Pacific where no satellite could map, no signal could transmit, no ship had ever returned from. And the crew was beginning to understand why. The ocean was wrong. No waves, no wind, no motion at all. The water did not ripple against the ship's hull. The sky, though clouded, did not shift. The air did not move, as if the world itself had paused. It was as if the sea had been frozen in time, and the Harbinger had somehow fallen out of sync with reality. The stillness. Kessler stood at the helm, gripping the steel railing so hard his knuckles turned white. His entire life had been spent on ships, military destroyers, Foundation vessels. Hell, even whaling boats in his younger years. He had seen every kind of ocean imaginable. But never this. The water was like glass, reflecting nothing but an endless, formless dark. Even the ship's wake, the white foamy churn of water behind them, was absent. The Harbinger moved forward, but left nothing behind, as if it wasn't really there. A shiver crawled up his spine. "Tell me you're seeing this," Kessler muttered. Dr. Voss, standing beside him, stared into the void. The researcher's usual air of clinical detachment had cracked. Voss hesitated. "I don't think we should be here." Kessler grunted. "No shit." Behind them, the crew whispered. Even the mercenaries, men who had seen horrors they would never speak of, were uneasy. Time is breaking. Then came the first failure. A sharp click. The chronometers reset to 0. Every clock aboard the Harbinger, wristwatches, digital readouts, navigation timers, all simultaneously blinked to 0, 0, 0. "Captain!" the navigator called from his station, his voice too calm for the terror in his eyes. "Something's wrong with the instruments." Kessler glanced at the bridge monitors. The ship's internal time tracking system was looping, resetting every 30 seconds. Voss checked his wristwatch. He faltered. The second hand wasn't moving. No, that wasn't right. It was moving, but in the wrong direction. Tick by tick, it counted backward. Then someone screamed, "Where's Kowalski?" The entire bridge turned toward the engineer's station. It was empty, but Kowalski had been right there. He had spoken not 30 seconds ago. The crew was frozen. No one had seen him leave. There was nowhere to go. "Emin, guys?" The voice was right behind them. Kowalski was standing at the other end of the bridge, confused, his hand on his sidearm. Every single person turned to stare. No one had seen him move. Kowalski looked around, eyes darting from face to face. "What the hell is wrong with you all?" "You," Kessler stepped forward. "You were just over there." "No, I wasn't." "You were," Voss whispered. "You were. Literally just." "I was in the engine room," Kowalski snapped. "I came straight here after checking the main coolant line." The bridge was silent. He had never gone to the engine room. He had been on the bridge a moment ago, speaking, laughing, right here. Nope. Now he wasn't sure. He staggered back, rubbing his temples. I don't remember walking here." No one spoke. No one moved. Voss turned back to his console, his hands shaking. He checked the internal ship logs. Security footage should confirm. The files were blank. The timestamps did not exist. The depths respond. A deep boom vibrated through the Harbinger's hull. The kind of sound that shouldn't exist underwater. It wasn't sonar. It wasn't an impact. It was a pulse. It resonated through the ship, rattling the light fixtures, shaking the monitors. The deck beneath them trembled. And then the radio came to life. A burst of static. Then a voice. Not land. Not dead. Eyes watching. The bridge fell deathly silent. It was the voice of their lost drone pilot, the one who had vanished when they first entered the black zone. But he had been gone for hours, and he was still screaming. "Can't see it, but it's here, it's here." The radio cut out. Then the ship lurched violently. Kessler was thrown into the steel railing, pain blooming along his ribs. The bridge crew collapsed against their consoles. Below deck, alarms blared. They were sinking, drowning in the dark. "Engines to full," Kessler roared, dragging himself upright. The crew scrambled. The ship wasn't just sinking, it was being pulled down. The ocean around them, so still moments ago, had turned into a black, writhing mass. Voss stared in horror at the monitor. "The depth gauge. It's impossible." The numbers were scrolling endlessly, the ocean floor somehow falling away beneath them. It wasn't that they were sinking. It was that the ocean was deepening, as if the very world was being reshaped beneath them. The pulse returns. Then the pulse came again. This time closer. This time it hurt. The lights flickered violently, casting shadows where there should be none. The air shuddered, as if the ship was not alone. Kowalski staggered forward, blood pouring from his nose. His eyes were wide, unfocused. "It's here," he rasped. "What the hell are you talking about?" Kessler growled. Kowalski turned. His mouth opened, and something else spoke. "You are looking, but you do not see." A sound not meant for human ears crawled through the room, a noise like metal bending beneath the weight of something impossible. Kowalski screamed. His body convulsed, then snapped backward at a grotesque angle. His rib cage split open from within. And then, nothing. The room was still again. Kowalski was gone. Not dead, not collapsed. Gone, as if he had never been there at all. The ocean outside the window shuddered, and something, somewhere beneath them, breathed. Chapter 3. Land Without a Name. The Soundless Ridge. The FCS Harbinger drifted through a sea that no longer behaved like the one they had known. The water was thick with something unseen, something dense, something watching. A place like this should not exist. Yet the sonar told them otherwise. "Contact," the navigator muttered. His voice was strained, hollowed out by the things he'd seen in just the last few hours. "Something massive, 30 degrees starboard." Kessler stepped forward. The screen in front of them glowed with a ghostly silhouette stretching across the abyss, like an underwater continent. A ridge. No, a plateau. A mass so vast it should have been on every chart, every map, every record. Yet it had never existed. Until now. No readings, no data, no sense. The ship banked gently, thrusters stabilizing them above the landmass. Floodlights pierced the abyss, illuminating an impossible surface below. It did not look like rock. It was organic, but not in any way that made sense. The surface rippled under the glow, as if reacting to the light. Massive trenches ran like veins across the landscape, lined with formations that resembled coral yet pulsed with faint, bioluminescent color. "Jesus," Voss whispered. "What the hell is that?" No one answered. The science team immediately deployed the drones, sending them into the deep like mechanical carrion birds. Their lights disappeared into the vastness below, blinking out one by one as the thick ink-black water consumed them. The data stream was nonsense. No readings, no depth measurements, no seismics. The machines reported nothing at all, as if they had been swallowed by a void. Kessler clenched his jaw. "Are we getting anything?" The sonar tech checked his screen. His hands were shaking. "It's not reflecting anything, sir. No heat, no mass." "Then what the hell are we looking at?" A step into the unfathomable. Kessler made the call. "Prep the drill." The crew hesitated, the tension thick as the abyss itself. Voss looked up sharply. "Are you insane? This isn't rock. We don't even know if it's solid." "We came to get answers." Kessler's voice was dead steel. "We take a sample, and we leave." He didn't believe that last part. The drill team assembled, lowering the primary bore rig onto the landmass. The arm extended, its steel teeth gleaming under the ship's harsh spotlights. A tense silence filled the air as the mechanism spun up, whirring faster and faster until it made contact. The moment the drill touched the surface, the entire ridge quivered. Not like a tremor, not like a shift in stone. It contracted, like flesh, like something that could feel. The drill stopped cold. The pressure readings went wild, gauges snapping to redline levels. Then, boom, the drill exploded. The impact sent shrapnel ripping through the rig, tearing metal apart as the shock wave rocked the ship. Sparks rained down onto the deck. A crew member near the console was thrown back, his skull hitting the bulkhead with a sickening crack. Blood pooled beneath him. The sound returns. The landmass twitched. Something beneath them shifted, causing the ship to list violently to port. The sonar screamed, an impossible seismic event registered below. Something was waking up. Something was reacting. And then came the sound. It didn't come from the speakers. It didn't come through sonar. It came from inside their skulls. A deep, low-frequency pulse. Not noise, not words, but something more ancient than language itself. Kessler's vision swam. His nose bled. His ears rang with something primal, something planetary, something beyond cognition. The crew screamed. One man clutched his temples, eyes rolling into the back of his head before he collapsed foaming at the mouth. A scientist stabbed himself in the throat with a screwdriver, his expression blank, as if his body had simply been instructed to die. The sound intensified. Kessler felt his mind splitting apart. Something was looking at them now. And it wasn't pleased. The veiled tears. And then, everything stopped. The air went still. The ship's instruments died. The landmass below them, so vast, so wrong, was gone. Not crumbling, not dissolving, not sinking. Gone. 1 second there, The next, as if it had never existed at all. The crew, bleeding and broken, stumbled to their feet. The ocean was back to normal. The instruments worked. The stars overhead had realigned. But the drones were gone. The drill was gone. And so were 3 crew members. Not dead. Not even a trace of them left behind. Voss staggered forward, gripping the console. He was panting, eyes wild, his face pale as a corpse. Well, we were just... His breath hitched. It was just there. Kessler stared at the black, empty ocean below. No, he swallowed. It was never there. Chapter 4. A breath beneath the sea. Something moves beneath them. The FCS Harbinger drifted above a void where, moments ago, something impossibly large had been. A landmass, no, a body, had stretched across the abyss below, pulsing with alien ridges and bioluminescent scars. Then it had simply ceased to exist. No seismic collapse, no debris, just gone. The ocean had reset itself. But something remained in the silence. A pressure, a weight pressing down on the ship, on their lungs, on their minds. It was like the sea had gained consciousness, like it was watching. And then, the first tremor. Not an earthquake, not a normal shifting of the ocean floor. It was too rhythmic, too alive. A single deep thump that rolled through the water in slow intervals, each pulse shaking the ship's hull like a great planetary exhalation. A heartbeat. You're hearing this, right? Darcy, one of the deep-sea engineers, adjusted the controls on his dive suit. His voice came through the ship's comms, his breath ragged but calm. Kessler stood at the command station, listening. Loud and clear. You still good to go? Darcy let out a dry chuckle. Not really, but let's get this over with. The plan was simple. Retrieve a sample. The drill was gone. The landmass was gone. But traces of whatever they had touched might still be present. Organic residue, fragments, something. Darcy's tether hissed as he was lowered into the abyss. Through the helmet cam, the crew watched as he disappeared into ink-black water, his suit's floodlights illuminating a murky nothingness. But there was something wrong with the visuals. The edges of the camera flickered, static bleeding into the feed like a corrupted signal. Voss squinted at the screen. Adjust your camera focus. You're getting interference. I'm not doing anything, Darcy replied. It's just... He hesitated. Then softly, it's too quiet down here. No sound, no current, no ocean. Even at this depth, there should have been ambient noise, the distant, faraway groans of tectonic pressure, the slow yawning of the deep, fish scattering from the lights. But there was nothing. Darcy's own breathing was the only thing audible. The light from his helmet glowed against the emptiness, cutting through thick gelatinous water that did not move. Then he saw it, a scar in the void, a wound in the ocean itself. The tether camera zoomed in, and what they saw should not have existed. It was not rock, not sand, not coral. It was meat, a long gash in something organic, surrounded by shredded strands of translucent tissue that swayed in an unseen current. The Harbinger's bridge fell silent. Darcy, Kessler's voice was tight. Get a sample and get back up. No argument. Darcy reached out, his gloved fingers brushing against the tissue. It shuddered. Not like a dead thing. Not like decay. Like something alive. The tremor returned. A deep planetary pulse rolled through the sea. The ship shuddered. The comms erupted into garbled static. Then Darcy screamed. A vanishing without struggle. The tether snapped. Not frayed, not severed by tension. It was cut. The edges were clean, as if sliced by something that did not leave a trace. Darcy's helmet camera flickered, the screen distorting. The crew leaned forward, staring in horror as their last glimpse of him showed nothing. Darcy was gone. His last scream looped in the comms, playing back out of sequence. And what? No, that's not. No. The words reversed, overlapped, distorted, like a broken record of a man who never existed. Kessler gripped the railing. Darcy, do you copy? Silence. Then, not gone, not gone? No. The lights flickered violently. The bridge's metal walls groaned as if something immense was shifting just beyond their senses. Something stirred in the dark, and the ocean, which had been still for so long, began to ripple. The Harbinger was no longer alone. The abyss breathes. The sonar screamed. Every gauge redlined, numbers flickering off the charts. Voss checked the readings and went pale. That's impossible. What? What is it? Kessler barked. Voss swallowed. His hands trembled. The depth gauge is reading a displacement the size of North America. The ship lurched violently. A second tremor rolled through the abyss, closer this time, shaking the water itself. Something was rising. Or worse, something had never left. Kessler grabbed the intercom. All hands, battle stations, we need to move now. The engines roared to life, but the ocean did not let them go. A current formed out of nowhere, a slow, dragging force pulling them downward. Like an inhale, like something was breathing them in. And then something brushed the hull. The entire ship groaned like a dying animal as the unseen mass pressed against it. The bridge crew collapsed as the lights exploded overhead, the ship pitching violently downward. And then the comms came alive again. A whisper. No, a voice. A voice that did not belong to Darcy. It was not human. It was not kind. It did not care for them. It was older than speech. And yet, it spoke. You were never meant to find me, but now you have, and now you will be forgotten. The Harbinger was dragged into the black, and the abyss closed behind them. Chapter 5. The First Vanishings. The Missing. The FCS Harbinger drifted through black water, swallowed by an ocean that had become a void. The air inside the ship felt heavier, thick with an unseen weight. Kessler stood in the dim glow of the bridge monitors, staring at the sonar. The readings had been useless for hours now. The landmass had disappeared. Darcy had vanished mid-sentence, and their only response from the abyss had been a voice that did not belong to anything human. That voice still whispered in his skull, a phantom pressure against his temples. You were never meant to find me, and now you will be forgotten. The words slithered in the dark. Kessler shook them off. Roll call, he ordered. The crew began to list their names one by one, confirming their presence. Then someone stopped. A long, terrible silence. Where's Ramirez? The bridge crew froze. No one had seen him leave. No one had seen him die. His station was still warm, his chair still rotating slightly, as if he had been sitting there seconds ago. Then Voss checked the ship's personnel log. Ramirez's name was not there. Not marked as deceased. Not marked as transferred. Just gone. Like he had never been a part of the crew at all. Voss stumbled back, face pale. This isn't possible, his entry. It's rewritten. Kessler took the data pad from him. He scrolled back through the logs, past launch, past deployment, past their initial descent into the black zone. Ramirez's name was missing from all of them. It was as if the man had never existed. Then someone else spoke. Who's Ramirez? The crew turned to look at him. It was Kowalski. Kowalski, who had been joking with Ramirez just 2 hours ago. There was no recognition in his eyes. Kessler's stomach turned. Ramirez, the engineer, he was standing right next to you? Kowalski's face twisted in confusion. He genuinely did not remember. None of them did. The logs had changed, and so had their memories. Something was erasing them. Not killing. Not abducting. Resync, like they had never existed at all. The forgotten. The ship lurched again, rocked by an unseen force. Another low tremor pulsed through the water, deep, steady, a heartbeat from something sleeping beneath them. The crew was dwindling, and now Kessler was no longer sure how many had been aboard in the first place. He tried to count the survivors in his head. Was it 20? 15? 12? Every time he reached a number, it slipped away, like trying to hold on to a dream after waking. Then the alarm klaxons wailed. Kessler snapped out of his thoughts. Rip. One of the technicians frantically tapped his console, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's Kowalski, sir. His life signs." The screen in front of them flickered violently. The crew turned. Kowalski was gone. His boots were still on the floor. His uniform still lay in a crumpled heap, as if he had been peeled out of existence, layer by layer. His name had already been scrubbed from the logs. Then Voss, his voice hoarse, shaking, checked the crew's recorded mission brief from before launch. The video played back perfectly. Kessler, Voss, the other officers, the mercenaries, the specialists. But no Kowalski. Not a trace of him. Voss's hands trembled. "I swear to God, Forget it," Kessler cut in. "Forget it. We're not waiting to be picked off one by one. We strike." Voss hesitated. "You think we can even—" "Doesn't matter," Kessler growled. "We have to try." The first strike. The Foundation harpoons had been designed for impossible hunts. 30 feet long, coated in a reality-anchoring alloy, tipped with high-yield neurotoxin payloads that could kill a Class V Vi anomalous entity in seconds. And now, they were aimed at the abyss. The weapons bay doors hissed open, revealing the silent black beyond. The ocean was motionless, but Kessler could feel it shifting. Like lungs inhaling. Like something was waiting. Then, fire. The ship shuddered violently as the harpoons launched, 5 in total, each the size of a bus, spearing through the dark. They impacted something unseen. The entire ocean trembled. A sound ripped through the deep, deafening, seismic, shaking the Harbinger down to its bones. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a scream. It was laughter. The sound reverberated through the ship, through their bones, through the very fabric of reality itself. The crew collapsed, clutching their heads as their vision blurred, as if their bodies were being rewritten mid-existence. Voss vomited blood. Another tremor. Then the harpoon's data feeds went blank. One by one, as if they had never been fired at all. And then there was less. When the crew regained consciousness, the ship was silent. The ocean was still, and the harpoons were gone. Not destroyed, not floating, gone, like they had never existed. Kessler pushed himself up, vision still spinning. His ears were ringing, his nose was bleeding. He turned, counting the survivors. There were fewer than before. He tried to remember their names. They were already gone. Voss staggered to the console, wiping blood from his lips, his hands shaking as he pulled up the logs. He froze. The mission file. The launch reports. The crew manifest. They had never fired the harpoons. There was no record of an attack. The log said they had never armed them in the first place. The weapons had never existed. Kessler clenched his jaw. Then came the final, deepest tremor yet. A pulse. A heartbeat. Something vast shifted below. Something aware. And in the abyss, the last whisper came. A voice like a mother singing a lullaby to a dying world. There is no war to fight. There is no hunt. You are not even prey. You are already gone. And then, the FCS Harbinger began to sink into the dark. into nothing. Chapter 6. The harpoons are swallowed. The last shot into the abyss. The FCS Harbinger groaned under its own weight, its hull shaking in the eerie silence left behind by the missing harpoons. For a few moments, no one spoke. The ocean around them had stopped moving, thick and undisturbed, as if it had never known motion at all. Kessler swallowed the copper taste of blood in his mouth and forced himself upright. His vision swam, his head pounded with something deeper than a headache, a wrongness, something pressing against his mind like a foreign thought trying to take root. He barely had time to process what had just happened before the first anomaly occurred. A sound not meant for human ears erupted through the water. A low, stretched-out groan, like the sound of steel warping under impossible pressure. The ship lurched violently, and for a moment, just a moment, Kessler felt as if the Harbinger was being pulled in two different directions at once. A sensation of being unmade. And then the sonar screens flickered back on. And the readings made no sense. Something is here, but it is not here. Jesus, Voss muttered, staring at the data. He hesitated. What? Kessler demanded, still gripping the console for balance. Voss turned to him, eyes hollow with something close to dread. The harpoons hit something. Kessler exhaled sharply. Good. Then Voss shook his head. No. You don't get it. They hit something that isn't there. Kessler's breath stalled. What do you mean? Voss's hands trembled as he zoomed in on the sonar returns. The impact points were visible, but there was no mass, no heat signature, no density. The harpoons had embedded into something that did not exist. For the first time, Kessler felt it, the wrongness in his gut, the nauseating certainty that they had never been hunting anything. They had been looking for something that did not want to be found. And now it had noticed them. The ocean collapses. Then the ocean broke. The sonar went white-hot, an unreadable explosion of corrupted data and warping physics. The sea did not move. It inverted. The black, endless water folded inward, a monstrous gravitational force dragging the Harbinger down in a way that should not have been possible. It was not sinking. It was being pulled into something that did not exist. Metal shrieked as the hull compressed. The bridge crew collapsed to the floor, blood pouring from their noses, ears, and eyes as the pressure ripped at their skulls. Something beyond them, something old, something inhuman, was reaching inside the ship, into their memories, into their identities. Kessler gasped for breath, but his lungs forgot how to function. Someone screamed, but the sound looped, repeating backward and forward in a stuttered, broken way. One of the mercenaries, Bennings, his body folded backward in an unnatural angle, his bones cracking like twigs as his skin peeled away in slow, curling ribbons. Voss convulsed, his body flickering in and out of existence, his form breaking into disjointed pieces that did not align. Then the walls bulged inward. The air compressed into a vacuum, sucking at their skin. And in the silence, the whispers came. Not from the comms, not from any one place, from everywhere, from inside them. It was never meant to be found. They do not know. They do not see. Let them go. They are already dead. And then everything stopped. The pressure was gone. The ocean was calm. And the Harbinger was floating. Something lost interest. The ship was released. The moment was so abrupt, so violently unnatural in its simplicity that Kessler's mind refused to process it at first. 1 second they had been on the edge of annihilation. The next, it was as if nothing had ever happened. The ship drifted on motionless water, the sky above untouched, the abyss below still and empty. But something was missing. Kessler turned to Voss, but Voss was gone. Not dead. not ripped apart, just never there. Kessler scanned the bridge, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Half the crew was gone. The remaining survivors did not notice at first. The bodies were not there. No blood, no trace. The ship logs had rewritten themselves. Voss's name was absent. His research logs were empty. Kessler stared at the console, his hands trembling. Voss had been his best friend for 5 years. Now when he tried to think about him, there was nothing there, just a shape in his memory that did not belong. Kessler forced himself to stand, his body aching from the violence of what had just happened. His fingers hovered over the console. He tried to type Voss's name. The letters refused to form. Something had let them go. Something had decided they were not worth remembering. And now they were just ghosts, adrift in a sea that had erased them before they had even begun. SCP-169 had never been asleep. It had simply chosen not to care. Until now. And the worst part? The crew of the Harbinger would never even know. Because soon they would be gone too. Just like Voss. Just like the harpoons. Just like everything that had ever tried to touch the thing beneath the sea. Chapter 7. The ship tilts into nowhere. A sea without a bottom. The FCS Harbinger floated adrift, its engines silent, its crew fractured by what could not be explained. The ocean had changed again. No one spoke. No one could. Half the crew had been erased, their names stripped from the ship's rosters, from memories, from existence itself. The remaining men and women felt the holes where others should have been, but their minds refused to process them. Kessler, still gripping the command console, swallowed against the aching void in his head. Something was missing, someone important. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, the thought unraveled like a dream forgotten upon waking. The ship shuddered. The Harbinger had stopped moving, not because it had anchored, but because there was nothing left to move against. The abyss below them stretched infinitely. The ocean floor was gone. Looking down, Kessler forced himself to stand. He felt cold, his limbs unsteady. He turned to the bridge crew, what little remained of them. "Turn on the floodlights," he ordered. A hesitation, then someone flicked the switch. The ship's powerful spotlights ignited, piercing the black veil below. For a moment, there was nothing but water. Then the lights hit something. Kessler's stomach twisted. It was impossible. Struck massive cyclopean formations of stone, carved with unfathomable geometry, stretching down into the infinite deep. Great arches, lined with spiraling runes, each one larger than a skyscraper. Columns jutting from the abyss, worn and broken, their shapes too complex to be natural. And something else. Something that made his breath catch. In the center of it all, the ruin formed the shape of a colossal, unblinking eye. Not one carved into the rock. Not a symbol. Something that had once lived, and had been buried. Or worse, groaned. The crew stared in horror. This shouldn't be here," someone whispered. Then it moved. A city that breathes. The runes shifted, not as if collapsing, not as if disturbed by currents, but as if responding to their presence. A deep tremor rippled through the abyss, the stone folding in on itself. The arches bent unnaturally, twisting, snapping, rearranging themselves into something new, or rather something old, waking up. Kessler staggered back as the abyss deepened. No, it was not deepening. It was expanding. Reality folded outward, widening into an infinite hunger, as if the abyss had been a closed mouth that was only now beginning to open. A great inhale of the world itself. The ship tilted forward. A slow, unnatural angle. The Harbinger's hull groaned, metal screaming under the force of something greater than gravity itself. Kessler grabbed the railing. "Engines! Get us the hell out of here!" The thrusters ignited. But the ship did not move. The ruins continued shifting, their impossible shapes merging into a great spiraling form, an endless staircase descending into nothing. Something was waiting at the bottom. Something awake. The descent begins. The ship tilted further. No one could stop it. The crew screamed, tumbling across the deck as the Harbinger leaned forward, its bow now pointing directly into the spiraling ruin below. The abyss had them, and it was pulling them in. Kessler fought against the incline, his vision blurred, his ears ringing with a sound that was not real. A voice. No, not one. Many. Thousands. Millions. "We see you." The ship dropped into the dark. Chapter 8. The Ocean Speaks. The Sound That Should Not Be Heard. The FCS Harbinger was falling. The ship, once a predator of the deep, was now nothing more than a grain of dust tumbling into the throat of something unfathomably vast. The ruins below had rearranged themselves into a descending spiral of impossible geometry, a formation that was not built but grown, its stone moving as if it had muscle and bone. And somewhere at the bottom, a presence waited. Then came the sound. Not an explosion, not a roar, not even a voice. It was a pulse, a thump so immense that it did not just vibrate through the water, but through reality itself. A sound that was not heard, but felt, absorbed, devoured by the very atoms of their bodies. The crew collapsed, clutching their heads as their vision bent sideways, their skulls feeling too small for the thing that was pressing into them. Then, someone spoke, but it was not their voice. The words of the drowned. Kessler reeled, his teeth clenching as the noise warped his sense of self. He blinked against the blood running from his nostrils and ears, fighting the nausea writhing in his gut. Then he heard it. A whisper. No. A chorus of voices, speaking in languages no human mouth had spoken in millennia. The words dripped from Galloway's lips, one of the Harbinger's gunners, a man who had barely spoken more than 3 words the entire mission. Now he was chanting in a voice that was not his own. His eyes rolled back until only the whites remained. Foam gathered at his lips. Kessler grabbed him, shaking him violently. "Galloway, snap the hell out of it." Galloway ignored him. His mouth kept moving, lips forming syllables that should not exist in human throat structures. Then another voice joined in. Then 3. Then 5. The bridge filled with whispers, a cacophony of dead tongues, echoing from the throats of men and women who did not know what they were saying. Kessler's blood ran cold. They were not possessed. They were remembering not their own memories. Memories not meant for human minds. Memories that do not belong. Voss was on his knees, shaking violently. His lips moved against his will. I remember the day we sank," he murmured, tears streaming down his face. His voice trembled in something close to grief, reverence, terror. Kessler grabbed him. "Voss, what the fuck are you talking about?" Voss looked at him, and for a moment Kessler saw something else staring back. Something old. Something that had once lived in a time when the world was not made for humans. "I remember the city," Voss whispered. His hands grasped blindly at his temples, as if trying to pull something out of his own skull. It wasn't supposed to fall. We were supposed to last. We were supposed to—" He let out a raw, choking sob. "I remember when the ocean took us." Kessler felt the hair on his arms stand up. "What city, Voss?" he demanded. "What the hell are you talking about?" Voss shook his head violently, his nails scratching his own scalp until they drew blood. Then he whispered, "The first one," and the lights exploded. The logs rewrite themselves. Sparks rained down over the bridge as the emergency lights flickered, dim, red, breathing like a dying heartbeat. The monitors glowed strangely, the text scrolling in patterns that no one could recognize. The ship's logs were rewriting themselves. Kessler turned, eyes widening as the ship's manifest changed in real time. The names of the crew were vanishing. New ones were replacing them. Not human names, not names written in any earthly language. He saw the first few, Saruth Calveneth, last remnant of the drowned kings. It devours time. Kessler. Kessler's own name was there, but it had always been there. His hands trembled. He scrolled backward, scanning the previous entries. The Harbinger's logs did not begin when they launched from Site 47. They began before that, before humans existed, before the ocean was the ocean, before something that should not remember had begun to wake up. Then the bridge windows cracked, and the whispering in the ship turned into screaming. The abyss answers. The ship tilted further into the abyss. The ruins below were no longer ruins. They were rebuilding themselves. The ancient city, the first city, was reforming, restitching its lost architecture, using the bones of its drowned dead to rebuild what had been stolen from it. Kessler looked down through the cracked glass, and the abyss looked back. A single, vast, monolithic shape, darker than the void itself, slithered across the ruins, reshaping the world in ways the human brain was never meant to perceive. It was not a creature. It was not a god. It was a memory of something that should have never existed. And now it was waking up again. Then the final pulse came, a sound like the end of an era, and the Harbinger plunged into nothing. Chapter 9. A Lightless Eye. The Rising Land. The FCS Harbinger was falling, not in the way a ship sinks, swallowed by water and gravity. No, this was something else. It was like being pulled, dragged, against the will of physics itself. For a moment the abyss had been empty, a yawning black trench, infinite and hungry. Then, without warning, something rose beneath them. Something new. Something wrong. It didn't surface in the way land should. It didn't push up from tectonic shifts or break through the ocean in an eruption of foam and stone. It unfolded. The landmass was not there, and then it was. A vast ridge of something that almost resembled rock, yet shifted and flexed with movements that were not geological. It wasn't solid. It wasn't alive. It was rewriting itself in real time. A landscape that breathes. Kessler stared through the bridge viewport, his gut twisting in protest at the thing forming beneath them. It was not natural. It looked like something's spine stretching into the dark, jagged and uneven, covered in ridges that pulsed with an unseen rhythm. The textures, if they could be called that, were shifting even as they watched, reforming, as if deciding what shape it wanted to be. Stone turned to muscle. Muscle became bone. Bone split and bled into something smooth and wet, an exposed surface the size of a city, glistening in the dim light of the Harbinger's failing floodlights. And then they saw it. A void in the deep. A shape that should not exist. The lightless eye. At first it was mistaken for another trench, a bottomless pit forming in the middle of the shifting terrain. Then it blinked. Not physically. There was no lid, no pupil, no iris. But something shifted within it, like a hole in the fabric of the world itself. It wasn't black. It wasn't a color at all. It was absence. A gaping, lightless eye. The ship's floodlights strained against it, but no reflection came back. No outline, no depth. It was like staring into a wound in reality, a piece of space where light did not belong. And it was looking at them. The instruments died. The Harbinger's consoles shut down simultaneously, screens going black, dials freezing mid-movement. The ship's power grid sputtered, the lights dimming into a low, sickly glow. The engine died. Everything stopped. A deep pressure formed in Kessler's skull, something immense looming over them, pressing down with the weight of a world that should not be awake. Then the sound came. A low, subsonic hum, vibrating through the hull, not through the water, not through the air, but through the space around them. Something was whispering. Not in words. Not in anything meant for human cognition. Kessler's vision doubled, the edges of his sight blurring as if something was trying to push itself inside his head. Then the crew began to bleed. The human body is not made for this. First, the gums, the soft tissue splitting, teeth shaking loose, dribbling from mouths as if their bodies no longer understood how to hold them in place. Then, the eyes. Capillaries burst, pupils dilating until the entire iris went black, veins standing out against pale, sweating skin. Crew members collapsed, clutching their heads, muttering, their voices overlapping, as if they were speaking and being spoken through at the same time. Voss fell to his knees, his lips trembling, his breath ragged. He was crying blood. "I see." His voice was weak, barely a whisper. Kessler grabbed him, shaking him. "You see what?" Voss looked up, and for a moment, just a moment, Kessler saw something else looking back. Something not him. Something older than the ocean. Then Voss started screaming. The ocean devours identity. The logs on the remaining bridge consoles began to glitch, data corrupting and rewriting itself again. Lines of text scrolled past, entire pages filling with symbols that were not human. Not words. Not language. Something else. A record of something that had not happened yet. Kessler forced himself to focus, eyes darting across the flickering display. The last entry on the ship's logs was written in a language that had never existed on Earth. Then the next line appeared. "The Harbinger is gone." Kessler's stomach lurched. "No," he whispered. Another line appeared. "Kessler never was." His hands shook violently. He tried to speak. But for a moment, just a moment, he felt the ocean shifting inside him. Something rewriting him. Something erasing. He gritted his teeth against the pressure, forcing his mind to stay whole. He would not let it take him. Not yet. He staggered toward the helm, fighting against the gravity that was no longer gravity, the ship tilting, the lightless eye pulling them downward into the dark. He had one last thought before the abyss swallowed the world. Something old had been watching them, and now it had decided to remember. Chapter 10. Those Who See Are Taken. Abyssal Hypnosis. The FCS Harbinger was no longer a ship. It was a lifeboat of ghosts, drifting above a wound in the world. The crew had stopped moving, stopped speaking. Some had stopped blinking. They were staring at the eye, the lightless void below them, not a pupil, not a sphere, but an absence, an impossible emptiness in the shape of vision itself. It did not reflect the ship's floodlights. It did not distort the water. It did not belong. And yet, the crew members who gazed into it could not look away. The first to go. Kessler felt the shift before he saw it. The ship's numbers felt wrong, like a room where too many people had just walked out, but no doors had opened. He turned, looking at the navigation officer. Henriksen had been at his station, staring through the viewport at the thing beneath them. Now he was standing perfectly still, mouth slightly open, eyes unblinking. Kessler moved toward him. "Henriksen?" he called. No response. Henriksen's lips moved. His voice was flat, mechanical, drained of any human inflection. "The deep does not forget." Kessler froze. The words had not been his. He knew Henriksen, he knew the way he spoke, the cadence of his voice. But this was something else speaking through his mouth. Then another crew member spoke, and another. One by one, the frozen bodies around him whispered the same thing. The deep does not forget. A chorus of monotone, glassy-eyed voices. And then Henriksen took a single step forward and disappeared. Not into the dark, not out the door, not into the abyss. He simply ceased to be. 1 second present, the next gone. Not a trace, not a shadow, not even a footprint where he had been standing. The numbers drop. Jesus Christ! Someone muttered behind Kessler, voice shaking. It was Galloway, the ship's gunner. He staggered back, horrified. What the fuck was that? No one answered. Because it happened again. The medic, Juno, who had been helping the wounded moments ago, was now standing motionless beside the exit, her fingers limp at her sides. Her lips moved soundlessly, repeating something inaudible. Then she took a step. Gone. Erased. As if she had never existed. The log screens updated without a single key being touched. Crew count 23. Then crew count 22. Then crew count 19. No alarms. No sound. No bodies. Just names vanishing one by one, replaced by a deep, empty silence where people should have been. Kessler turned toward the remaining crew. "We don't look at it," he ordered, his voice ragged. No one argued. The captain refuses to turn back. The bridge was collapsing into paranoia. No one spoke. No one moved. No one dared to acknowledge the space where their crewmates had just been. The air was thick with unspoken horror, as if putting words to it would make it real. Then Voss stepped forward. "We need to leave." Kessler turned toward him. "We don't leave until we get a goddamn answer." Voss let out a short, bitter laugh. "An answer? Kessler, we don't even know what the question is anymore." Kessler stepped closer, his breath heavy, his hands shaking. "If we turn back now," he said, his voice low, "we die for nothing." Voss stared at him. The rest of the crew did not move. The ship was bleeding people into nothingness, yet the captain refused to abandon the hunt, because in his heart he knew, if they turned back now, they would not return at all. This wasn't a hunt. It was a reckoning, and the ocean was not finished with them yet. Chapter 11. The hunt is over. A final shot into the abyss. The FCS Harbinger was barely a ship anymore. The engines were dead. The lights flickered with an unsteady, failing glow. The crew had been bled away, not through death, but through erasure, a quiet, endless culling, leaving only ghosts in the shape of memories. But the void was still there. The lightless eye loomed beneath them, a bottomless chasm where even the laws of existence refused to function. And Kessler had one last shot left, loading the last harpoon. The remaining crew worked in silence, faces pale, eyes hollow with exhaustion. The harpoon was 30 feet long, a spear built for gods, lined with reality-anchoring alloys designed to pierce things that should not exist. It carried a payload of experimental neurotoxins, enough to melt a Class V anomaly from the inside out. If there was anything in the universe that could kill whatever was beneath them, this was it. But Kessler already knew what would happen. The moment the order left his lips, the moment the harpoon was loosed into the abyss, he would have his answer. And he already knew he wouldn't like it. Still, he had to try. Fire. Lunch. The firing mechanism clicked, a deep mechanical thunk echoing through the ruined vessel. The harpoon shot forward, its metal frame glinting under the emergency lights, streaking toward the abyss below. For a brief moment, Kessler thought it would strike something. that it would embed into a mass unseen some great sleeping titan of flesh and bone. But the moment it touched the edge of the void, it ceased to exist. There is no impact, no collision, no detonation, no resistance. The harpoon was there, and then it wasn't. Kessler blinked. The crew stared. The firing data was still on screen. The logs confirmed it had been launched, but there was no record of trajectory. No impact point. No reading at all. It had not been absorbed. It had not been destroyed. It had been forgotten. And then the world shook. The ocean moves. A shock wave erupted from the abyss. Not an explosion, not a reaction. It was a ripple of motion, something too large to comprehend, shifting. Something that had been still for centuries, moving for the first time. The sea itself changed. The water did not churn, did not rise, did not create waves. Instead, the entire ocean tilted. Kessler felt it in his bones first, a slow, impossible tilting of gravity itself. Then the ship lurched sideways. Crew members collapsed, gripping onto whatever they could as the Harbinger twisted in the water, dragged by a force that did not belong to the earth. And then they saw it. A shape deep in the abyss, rolling over beneath them. It was not a body. Not in the way whales have bodies, not in the way gods have forms. It was an expanse. A continent-sized mass, something so vast that their minds could only process it as terrain, not a living thing. And it had just turned over. Kessler's stomach tightened. They hadn't woken something up. They had disturbed something already awake. And no, it was adjusting itself. Everything is wrong. The sky changed. The stars above them flickered, some vanishing, some moving in ways that should not be possible. The ship's instruments failed completely, screens corrupted, texts rewriting, logs collapsing into nonsense glyphs that had never belonged to humanity. And the whispers returned. This time, they were not speaking. They were laughing. A deep, resonant sound that cracked reality itself. Something vastly amused by the fact that humans had tried to strike it. A being that had lived before Earth had oceans, before the sky had meaning. A being that had forgotten humanity until now. And for the first time, it was considering whether they were worth remembering. Kessler's breath caught. The sea boiled beneath them. Something enormous was still moving, shifting, rising. He could feel it breathing, the slow exhalation of something so impossibly vast that the air itself trembled. Then the voice spoke. It did not come from the water. It did not come from the ship. It came from everywhere at once. A voice like tectonic plates shifting, like the collapse of time itself. And it simply said, "You are not hunters." The sound was so deep, so vast, that it fractured the minds of those who heard it. 2 crew members dropped dead instantly. Their neurons burned out from understanding something they should not have. Voss collapsed to his knees, screaming, blood pouring from his ears. And Kessler saw what the ocean had hidden, saw what had always been there, saw the end of the world, and that the ship was let go. The force stopped. The ocean was calm again. The abyss below vanished, as if it had never been there. The void had shut its eye, and the Harbinger was left to drift. Alone, forgotten. The hunt was over, and they had never been the hunters. They had been prey, not worthy of being devoured, not even worthy of being killed. And that was the worst part, because Kessler understood now. They hadn't fought something. They hadn't discovered something. They had been ignored, and soon they would forget they had ever been here at all, because the ocean did not remember the things it let live. It only remembered the things it consumed. and the Harbinger was already gone. Chapter 12. It is not a creature. The shaking of the world. The FCS Harbinger drifted in dead silence. The abyss beneath them was gone. The lightless eye had shut, vanishing as if it had never existed. The ocean was still. The void was no longer watching them. But something was still wrong, because the world was moving. It started as a tremor, something deep, something slow, something ancient, shifting beneath the sea. Then it became an earthquake that did not belong to the earth. The ocean breaks. Across the world, seismographs went insane. From Tokyo to California, from the Pacific Islands to the Arctic shelf, the earth twitched like a dying animal, spasming beneath forces it was never meant to contain. On the beaches of Chile, fishermen stood frozen as the sea was pulled back miles into the horizon, revealing the skeletons of things that should have never been unearthed. On the coasts of New Zealand, an entire island chain split apart as if sawn in half by an unseen force. In the Indian Ocean, satellites recorded a massive displacement of water, as if something vast had adjusted its weight ever so slightly. Then, the first tidal waves struck, the erasure of land. The first coastlines to vanish were the ones closest to the Harbinger's location. A wave hundreds of feet high ripped through Micronesia, swallowing entire villages in an instant. Indonesia was next. The earthquake had barely finished cracking the Sumatra fault line when the ocean surged inland, carrying the bones of a dead world with it. Then, in the Philippines, an island simply ceased to exist. Not drowned, not destroyed. As if the seafloor itself had rewritten its history, folding the land back into something that had never been there at all. Like the hand of an indifferent god had wiped it from the map. A realization too late. On the Harbinger's bridge, the remaining crew watched in horror as the ship's satellite feeds filled with destruction. They saw the land crack. They saw cities topple. They saw the world itself shift like a sleeper rolling onto its side, pushing the ocean with its weight. Then, for the first time, someone finally said it. This isn't a creature." Kessler turned, heart hammering. Voss was standing at the console, his eyes wide, face pale and soaked with sweat. "It's not a life form," he whispered. His fingers twitched violently, hovering over the unreadable data logs. The air in the room felt thinner, like the pressure was changing, like something was considering them. Voss licked his lips, voice cracking. "It's something worse. The truth comes too late." They had thought they were hunting a biological entity. Something that could be wounded, something that could be killed. A colossal beast, a living thing that existed in ways they could measure, categorize, classify. But SCP-169 was not alive. It had never been. Not in the way humans understood life. Not in the way the world had been designed to sustain it. It was something else. Something that existed beneath existence. Something that was part of the fabric of reality itself, stretching across time and space. Something that the ocean itself had simply grown around. It was not a sleeping titan. It was not awakening. It was simply shifting. And that was enough to alter the shape of the world. Does it even notice? Kessler's pulse thundered in his ears. He could feel the weight of realization sinking in, pressing down like gravity. They had never mattered. They had never posed a threat. They were not even worth its attention. And now the question loomed over them. Was it choosing to notice them now? Would it remember them? Would it turn its full awareness to the tiny, insignificant creatures who had dared to fire weapons at something beyond life and death? Or had they already been forgotten? The Harbinger shuddered violently, metal groaning as the ocean around them became impossibly heavy. The air crackled. Something deep in the ship's hull creaked, as if about to be crushed from the inside out. And Kessler knew, in that moment, that if it truly saw them, they would not exist at all. A choice not theirs to make. Voss staggered forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Captain." Kessler did not look at him, because he knew that if he turned to face him, Voss might not be there anymore, knew that the bridge might be empty, knew that he might already be the last man left alive. Instead, he watched the ocean, watched the water shift, watched the sea tremble beneath the force of something beyond comprehension. And then, for the first time, the motion stopped. Everything was still. The waves halted. The land ceased breaking. The air became normal again. It was over, because whatever it was, it had chosen not to remember them. Not because of mercy, not because of luck, but because, in the end, they had never been worth its thoughts at all. The world holds its breath. The oceans would calm in the days to come. The surviving populations would scramble for explanations. The Foundation would cover the losses, rewriting history, attributing the disasters to a string of unprecedented earthquakes. The world would recover. But something had shifted. Something was different now. The maps were wrong. The coastlines were not the same. And if you looked out at the right stretch of ocean, on the right kind of night, you would see the sea breathe, not with waves, not with tides, but as if something immense was just beneath the surface, resting, waiting, deciding. Chapter 13. The Captain Fails to Pray. The Whispering Walls. The FCS Harbinger was silent. The ship drifted through an ocean that no longer moved, above a void that had shut its eye. The world had changed. Coastlines were missing. The sea was different. But the Harbinger had not been swallowed. It had not been erased. Instead, it had been ignored. The ocean had let them go. And that was worse. The captain breaks. Kessler sat at the helm, his fingers digging into the steel console, his breathing slow and uneven. He should have felt relief. The thing below them, the thing that was not a creature, not a god, not even a mind as they understood it, had stopped moving. But Kessler knew the truth. They had only survived because they were not worth remembering. And that thought rotted something inside him. The writing begins. The first numbers appeared without him noticing. His hands moved without command, dragging across the cold metal bulkhead beside the helm. A pen, when had he picked up a pen? Scraped against the surface, the ink bleeding into the steel. He started as a number sequence. Not equations. Not calculations. Predict. 5:13. Kowalski vanishes. 5:47. The sea is not water. 6:21. Voss remembers something not his own. 6:59. The logs rewrite themselves. 7:16. The captain writes something that is not real yet. He blinked. That last one had just appeared. The pen was still in his hand. The ink was still drying. But Kessler had not written it. The ship writes its own future. His pulse pounded in his ears. He turned back to the bridge console. The logs were changing again, lines of text appearing in his own handwriting. The ship was documenting events before they happened. 7:32. The captain will see something he cannot describe. 7:45. The captain will say a name he does not know. 8:2. The captain will fail to pray. 8:15. The captain will be gone. Kessler's breath hitched. That last one, it was written in his own blood. The captain sees something he cannot describe. He turned back to the viewport, and something was there. Not the abyss. Not the lightless eye. Something else. Something that had been watching from the edges of his vision this whole time. Something that had only just now decided to reveal itself. The shape was impossible. It was not a form, not a mass. It was an idea trying to be born, something that was not real yet, but soon would be. Kessler felt his mouth move. He spoke a word he did not know, and his ears bled from the sound of it. The captain fails to pray. He did not realize he was on his knees, did not realize his hands were pressed together, fingers locked, like a man begging for something greater than himself. He was trying to pray, but no words would come, because there was nothing to pray to. Not anymore. The captain is gone. At 8:15, the bridge crew turned. Kessler had been there a moment ago. Now, there was nothing. Not a sound. Not a footprint. Not a breath of displaced air. Just a half-finished sentence, written in blood, curling off the bulkhead. It is not awake yet, but it is learning how to be. There was no record of a captain ever having been aboard the Harbinger, and soon no one would remember him at all. Chapter 14. The Wake of SCP-169. Drifting. In dead waters. The FCS Harbinger was adrift. Not in a storm, not in the jaws of something unfathomable, but in still, empty waters. The ocean was normal again, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. The void is gone. Voss opened his eyes to silence. For a moment he thought he had gone blind. Then he realized the ship's emergency lights had gone dark. The humming of failing electronics was silent. The ambient groan of the Harbinger's hull was gone. Everything was too still. He dragged himself to his feet, his head pounding, his body shaking. The bridge was empty. He remembered Kessler, his face pale, his hands shaking, the words he had written on the walls, the moment he vanished, mid-sentence. But now, was there ever a Kessler? Voss blinked, his mind sluggish, thoughts flickering out of order. He stumbled toward the viewport and froze. The black void was gone. The island was gone. The ruins, the abyss, the great lightless eye beneath the ship, gone, as if none of it had ever been real. A normal sea. The ocean that stretched before him was ordinary, blue-gray, rippled by wind, reflecting the overcast sky in a dull shimmer. It wasn't thick with gelatinous darkness. It didn't pulse with unnatural waves. It was just water. And that was wrong, because nothing about what they had seen, what they had felt, could just end like this. Something that size, something so vast it had swallowed the world in a breath. It didn't just go away. It didn't just vanish. Unless, of course, it had never moved at all. What do we remember? The survivors, the few who remained, began emerging from their stations. They looked at each other, suspicious, confused. Something was wrong with their faces. Something wrong with their expressions. Voss realized what it was. They were struggling to remember. Their memories were being rewritten. Even now, right in front of each other. They looked around the bridge, searching for the ones they had lost. But their names were gone. The logbooks, the mission reports, there was nothing. The Harbinger's crew roster had been wiped. There was no record of who had been aboard. No record of what had happened. No mention of Kessler. No mention of the harpoons. No mention of SCP-169. It was as if the Foundation had sent a ghost ship into the Pacific and had received a ghost ship in return. Did it even happen? Voss forced himself to think, to hold on to something, anything. The ruins, the trenches, the voice in his head. But the harder he tried to remember, the more the details slipped away, like water through his fingers, like a dream dissolving in daylight. The other crew members were muttering to themselves. What were we doing out here? We were tracking something, weren't we? Was there an earthquake? No one mentioned the abyss. No one mentioned the thing beneath them, because the ocean did not remember them, and soon they wouldn't remember it either. The world moves on. Over the next few days, the Harbinger limped back toward the Foundation's Pacific Research Hub. The radio came back to life. GPS coordinates locked in again. The sea behaved normally, as if the world was trying to convince them nothing had ever happened. But Voss knew. And in the dead of night, staring out at the still water, he heard a whisper. Not a voice, not a message, just a reminder. A heartbeat in the deep, slow, patient, indifferent. And he realized something then. Something worse than all the horrors they had seen. And SCP-169 had never been asleep. Because something that vast, something that endless, does not need to sleep. And worse, it does not need to wake up. It only needs to decide. And when it does, there will be no warning. There will be no disaster, no apocalypse, no last stand, because the ocean will simply change, and no one will remember the world was ever different, not even the sea itself. Chapter 15. Nothing remains. The data is gone. The FCS Harbinger limped through calm waters, a hollow wreck of a ship, still carrying the ghosts of things it could no longer remember. The survivors, those few who had not vanished into nothingness or been erased from time itself, were silent as they moved through the bridge, their eyes haunted, their faces drained of something vital. Something had been taken from them. Not just their friends, not just their captain, but their memories. Voss sat hunched over the main console, feverishly typing, searching, digging through the ship's data logs. Every file, every recorded moment, every sonar ping, every camera feed. Corrupted. Not deleted. Not erased. Rewritten. The ghost in the machine. The screens flickered, text scrolling in jagged lines of broken code, chunks of words twisting together in ways that made no sense. Voss ran his trembling hands over the keys, trying to pull the records back up, but the logs were nothing more than fractured timestamps, scattered symbols, and phrases that should not be there. Lines of text appeared. Greater than mission start 000. Greater than crew count. Error. Greater than objective redact. Greater than notes. The water is still. Greater than notes. The water is still. Greater than notes. The water is still. Voss gritted his teeth. These weren't the logs they had written. These weren't even logs from their mission. They were lies. A fabricated record of a ship that had never found anything. A ship that had never tracked SCP-169. A ship that had never even been here. Was never there. A low, distant tremor ran through the ship. Not a threat. Not a warning. Just a reminder. Voss stared at the screen as new text slowly wrote itself across the console. Greater than data recovery attempt failed. Greater than data recovery attempt failed. Greater than data recovery attempt failed. Then, below it, in his own handwriting, greater than there was nothing to find. Greater than it was never there. Greater than the ocean is still. Voss's skin went cold. His own logs. His own thoughts. But they had been changed. He had written them. But not like this. Someone else, or something else, had taken his words and bent them into something else. Something that erased all trace of what had happened. No proof, no evidence, no memory. Voss turned to the others. "There's nothing here," he whispered. The crew didn't respond, not because they didn't hear him, but because, deep down, they already knew. The instruments, the logs, the readings, all gone, as if the ship had never left port, as if the Harbinger had never been sent on this mission. As if SCP-169 had never existed at all. Voss's fingers curled into fists. No, He refused to believe it. The crew they had lost. The things they had seen. The captain writing equations on the walls, whispering things that weren't real yet. It had all happened. It had, hadn't it? The world adjusts itself. A slow, deep creak ran through the ship's hull. The Harbinger floated, adrift in a sea that was now just a sea. No anomalies, no seismic disturbances. The ocean was normal. The sky was normal. The world was normal. And yet Voss could feel something else lurking beneath the surface of reality itself. Something that had shifted the very foundation of the world. Not with violence, not with destruction, but with correction, as if something had simply adjusted, as if the ocean had been edited into something that had never known SCP-169's presence. Nothing is left. Voss exhaled slowly. He turned off the console. There was no point. The Foundation would ask for a report, and they would send back what little they had. But it wouldn't matter, because the moment the report was filed, the moment it was archived, the moment someone tried to recall the details, it would be gone, just like everything else, just like the crew they had lost, just like the continent-sized thing beneath them that had never moved, never woke, never cared. The ocean did not remember, and soon, neither would they. Chapter 16. No one is coming. The signal that doesn't exist. The FCS Harbinger drifted in a dead ocean, its hull creaking under the weight of something unseen, something unfathomable. The world had settled. The abyss was gone. The lightless eye had closed. The ocean had forgotten them. And now, it seemed the world had too. Voss wiped the sweat from his brow, fingers trembling as he turned the radio dial. The static hissed, sharp and unrelenting, a sound that should have been comforting in its normalcy. But something about it was wrong. Not the usual background hum of dead air. This was something else. This was emptiness. An unnatural void of sound, as if the radio waves themselves had been severed. Voss took a slow breath and adjusted the frequency. Harbinger to Site 47.do. You copy? Silence. He tried again. Site 47. This is the Harbinger. Respond. Nothing. A few of the remaining crew watched him, their faces drained, their expressions slack with exhaustion. They all knew. They hadn't heard a single broadcast in hours. The Foundation was silent. The entire world was silent. Voss gritted his teeth and punched the console. God damn it, respond. But the radio was dead. And deep down, Voss knew. It had never been alive to begin with. The Harbinger is not there. Kessler was gone. The logs were gone. The data was gone. And now, as Voss turned toward the ship's navigation console, he saw the last, final truth of it all. The Harbinger was gone too. Not physically, not literally. But the satellite logs, the ship's GPS registry, the worldwide Foundation tracking network, it no longer recognized them. There was no pain, no coordinates, no trace of the Harbinger's existence in the global network. It was as if the ship had never been recorded. It was as if the ocean itself had corrected the error. Voss felt a cold chill settle into his bones. This was not a system failure. This was not a malfunction. This was something far worse. This was erasure. They had been forgotten. And now, they were adrift in a world that no longer recognized they had ever existed. The silence of the deep. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly. Not a single wave. Not a single sound. The wind was gone. The currents had stopped. Even the ship's hull, which had groaned and shuddered against the pressure of the deep for days now, was still. The world was listening. Not in a way that felt curious. Not in a way that felt merciful. but in a way that felt like it was waiting for them to realize the truth. They were already dead. They had just not stopped breathing yet. Voss took a step back, his breath shaking. The few remaining crew members looked to him. Not with hope, not with expectation, but with resignation, because they all felt it now. The weight of nothing pressing down on them. The unbearable absence of sound, as if the ocean had not just abandoned them, but had wiped them from its history entirely. Nowhere left to go. Voss ran a hand through his hair, gripping at the strands until pain spiked through his scalp. They had no communications. They had no record of where they were. The Foundation would not come, because the Foundation did not know they existed anymore. Voss turned to the others, swallowing the growing terror in his chest. "We need to keep trying." One of the last mercenaries, a man named Griggs, let out a hollow laugh. "Trying what?" he muttered, staring blankly at the flickering monitors. "We aren't even real anymore." Voss clenched his jaw. "We're not dead," he said. "Not yet." Griggs lifted his eyes, something empty behind them. "You sure?" Voss didn't answer, 'cause he wasn't sure at all. Drifting into oblivion, the Harbinger floated. There was no sunrise. There was no wind. Only motionless water, stretching to an endless horizon, a world that had once been alive but was now cold and lifeless, as if the ocean itself had ceased to exist beneath them, as if it had decided that this ship, these men, this entire mission, had never mattered. The radio crackled. For a brief moment, Voss felt his heart leap. Then, the voice came, a whisper, hollow and ancient, bleeding through the static like a corpse exhaling its last breath. It was not a message. It was not a distress call. It was not anything human. It was a reminder. No one is coming. And then, silence. A silence that would never end. A silence that meant they were already gone. And soon, even they would forget why. Chapter 17. Home is Lost. The ocean has changed. The FCS Harbinger was still floating, still breathing, still dying. Voss sat at the helm, staring at the monitors that no longer made sense, fingers twitching over dead controls. They had no comms, no data logs, no proof of their journey. And now, as the ship's GPS blipped in and out, there was one final horror waiting for them. They were going home. But home wasn't there anymore. Navigating the impossible. "Are we moving?" Voss didn't answer. The words had come from Griggs, one of the last men still functioning, though his face was sunken, his eyes raw and distant. Voss knew what he was really asking. Does it matter? He stared at the ship's navigation system, watching as the coordinates flickered, vanishing and reappearing with different readings every time. The latitude and longitude should have pointed them toward Foundation-controlled waters. But every time the screen recalculated their location, they were somewhere new. Somewhere wrong. The land is gone. After 3 days, they saw the first sign of land, or what should have been land. The ship's floodlights illuminated jagged cliffs rising from the sea, cracked black stone that should not have been here. There were no islands in this part of the ocean. And yet, here they were. The rocks were unnatural, twisted in a way that defied the logic of erosion. Their angles were too sharp, their formations too perfect, as if they had been cut, shaped, placed. Voss swallowed, his throat dry. Check the charts. The surviving navigator, Reyes, wiped his shaking hands against his uniform, fingers twitching as he flipped through digital maps. His breath caught in his throat. "There's nothing here," he whispered. "What do you mean, nothing?" Voss snapped. Reyes turned to him, his face bloodless, drained of all color. "I mean, there's no record of this place ever existing." Voss turned back to the looming cliffs, jagged and silent, and suddenly the air felt thinner. The world had changed, and they were the only ones who knew. The GPS lies. Voss forced himself to keep working. They could fix this. They just needed to push forward. Reyes continued to fight with the navigation systems, recalculating every possible route toward Foundation waters. Nothing made sense. The GPS read incorrect locations, listing coordinates that belonged to land masses that did not exist. A ping marked them near the Mariana Trench. Then, off the coast of Chile. Then, near the Aleutian Islands. Each time, the ship had not moved. The ocean was lying. Or worse, it did not know what it was anymore. The world is rewritten. It wasn't just the GPS. It was the maps. It was the stars. At night, Voss stood on the deck, staring up at the sky, his breath thick in his throat. The constellations were wrong. Familiar shapes had moved, some stars were missing, others had shifted into impossible alignments. And worst of all, some of them weren't stars at all. They moved slowly, like something watching from above. Things too far away to see clearly. Things that had not been there before. Voss clenched his jaw. The world was rearranging itself. Not violently. Not in some grand cataclysmic event. But quietly. Subtly. As if something had adjusted reality, rewriting the very foundation of what the Earth was. And no one but them would ever notice, because no one else remembered the way it had been before. The foundation is gone. Voss stormed back into the bridge. "We need to contact anyone," he growled. "Not just Site 47, any Foundation installation, any ship, any relay station. Someone has to be out there." Reyes hesitated. I can try." He started scanning frequencies, flipping through known SCP Foundation communications channels. Static. Then more static. Then something worse. An automated voice repeating itself over and over, speaking in a mechanical tone that sounded eerily empty. "No known entity by that name exists." Reyes froze. Voss leaned in closer. "What the hell did it just say?" Reyes tried again, adjusting the frequency. The same response. Then again. Then again. Then, known entity by that name exists. And beneath it, faint, almost inaudible, just beneath the static. Laughed. Not mocking. Not cruel. Just distant. As if something far below them, deep beneath the water, had found this moment amusing. "The Harbinger is alone." Griggs sat against the bulkhead, laughing softly to himself. "This is it," he muttered. "This is how it ends." Voss turned sharply toward him. "Shut the hell up." But Griggs just shook his head. "The Foundation is gone," he said. "We are alone in the world." Voss refused to accept that. He couldn't. He turned back to Reyes, voice firm. "Keep scanning," he ordered. Reyes swallowed hard, his fingers still moving, still flipping through static-filled channels. He tried again. Then again. Then something new. Not a Foundation signal. Not a rescue. Just a whisper. A single phrase, spoken from nowhere, from everywhere, from something that did not belong. It was not a threat, not a warning. It was simply a truth. You were never meant to return. The radio died, and the Harbinger kept drifting into a world that no longer remembered it had ever existed at all. Chapter 18. Did We Ever Leave? The Journal That Shouldn't Exist. The FCS Harbinger drifted through an ocean that no longer recognized it. The Foundation was gone. Or rather, it had never been there. No one responded to their distress calls. The world itself had been altered, its lands rearranged, its maps rewritten. And now, Something else was wrong. Voss found Griggs in his bunk, staring at something with an expression of quiet horror. His fingers trembled as he clutched a small, leather-bound journal. Voss narrowed his eyes. The Harbinger didn't issue journals. No one aboard had personal effects. But there it was, a book that should not exist, resting in Griggs' hands like a relic from a life he had never lived. "Where did you get that?" Voss asked. Griggs didn't answer. Instead, he turned the book toward him, and Voss felt his stomach drop. The handwriting on the page was Griggs, but Griggs had never written it. The mission that already ended. The words were clear, legible, written in firm, steady strokes, but they were in past tense, as if the mission had already ended. Voss read the first few lines, his breath slowing. The FCS Harbinger was sent to track a signal in the Pacific. It was a hunt for something that should not be real. We descended beyond mapped territory. We found an island that was not an island, a landmass that rewrote itself while we watched. We fired harpoons. We fired weapons. None of it mattered. The ocean changed. The foundation was no longer real. The world rewrote itself around us. We were never meant to return. We were never meant to be remembered. The last line. Voss swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Then he saw the last sentence, scrawled at the bottom in rushed, uneven writing. Not written in ink, but in something darker, something smeared, as if it had been scratched onto the page in a moment of desperate realization. I was never here. The mind fractures. Griggs shook his head violently, his breath ragged, shallow. "I didn't write this," he whispered. I don't remember." Voss grabbed him by the shoulders, his own pulse hammering. "But it's your handwriting, Griggs." Griggs was trembling now, his pupils too wide, his body shaking like he was freezing from the inside out. "I don't remember writing it," he muttered. "I don't remember being here." And then his eyes changed. A slow, unnatural shift, as if something deep inside him had just given up trying to understand. Voss saw it in his face. The moment Griggs lost the memory. The moment it was taken from him. Griggs blinked. Then his entire body relaxed, like a man who had forgotten what he was afraid of. Like a man who had never been afraid at all. The vanishing of self. Voss stepped back. Griggs sat still for a long time, staring at the journal in his hands. Then, slowly, he flipped the page. It was blank. The words were gone. The mission was gone. There was no record of anything that had happened. Griggs blinked, his face blank, his expression quietly confused. Then he turned to Voss and said, "When are we supposed to leave?" Voss felt something inside him break. He grabbed the journal from Griggs, flipping through the pages desperately. Blank, blank, blank. It had never been written, and now neither of them could remember what they had just read. Did we ever leave? Voss stumbled backward, his head pounding. This wasn't just about the world forgetting them. This was about them forgetting themselves. Every record, every memory, every trace of their existence. Unwritten, elite, or worse, never real in the first place. Voss grabbed Griggs by the collar. "Do you remember where we were?" he hissed. Griggs stared at him. "Where? Do you remember what we were doing?" Griggs hesitated. His lips parted. Then his expression changed, like a man struggling to recall a dream that was already fading. His voice was flat, distant. "Did we ever leave?" The words hit Voss like a knife. He let Griggs go, stepped back. The ship creaked. Somewhere outside, the ocean breathed. And deep inside, Voss felt it. Something unraveling, something slipping, something being taken. The world adjusts. Griggs stood up calmly, his fear erased, his panic forgotten. "I guess I must have been dreaming," he muttered, stretching his arms. Voss felt sick. He turned toward the journal in his hands, the blank pages glaring at him. Then, at the very bottom, in the corner, where the ink had almost faded into nothing, a final message. The only thing left. The last sentence, scrawled in blood. A desperate reminder. If you can read this, you were never here. The words faded, and Voss felt the memory rip from his mind, like it had never been written at all. Chapter 19. A Vanishing World. The names start to fade. Voss stood in the bridge of the FCS Harbinger, gripping the railing, watching the last remnants of his world fall apart. The survivors moved around him in a dazed, sluggish state, their expressions blank, their movements slow, like people who had just woken from a coma and could not remember who they were. The names were the first thing to go. One by one, the crew lost them. At first it was subtle. "Hey, Reyes," Voss called, turning toward the navigator. "Get me a heading." Reyes froze. His fingers tensed over the console. Then, slowly, he looked up. His eyes were empty. Voss felt a cold, sinking sensation in his gut. He turned to Griggs standing at the helm. "You know him," Voss insisted, voice tight. "You've been working with him this entire time." Griggs frowned. Then he shook his head. "I don't know him." Reyes swallowed, looking at his own hands as if they did not belong to him. "Oh, I don't know me either," he whispered. Forgetting each other. Within an hour, half the remaining crew forgot who they were. Voss tried to keep track, writing names on a piece of scrap paper, whispering them under his breath like a prayer. But when he looked down, the words were gone. No ink, no scratches, no indentations. As if the paper had never been written on. Voss clenched his fists, nails biting into his palm. The ocean was still. The sky was blank, and the world was disassembling itself around them. The ship begins to rot. The Harbinger had been a state-of-the-art vessel, reinforced by foundation-grade alloys, designed to withstand extreme pressure, corrosive environments, anomalous interference. Now, it was falling apart. The steel had rusted overnight. The paint peeled away in strips, revealing a hull that should have lasted decades, but now looked as though it had been abandoned for centuries. The lights flickered, then died. The ship's engines sputtered, failing one by one. The air smelled of mildew, of decay, of something long dead. Voss ran a hand along the bulkhead, feeling the surface crumble beneath his fingertips. It wasn't just aging. It was being erased. The ship was unmaking itself, piece by piece, the way a forgotten thing ceases to exist. Voss turned to Griggs, panic rising in his chest. "We have to stop this," he said, voice shaking. Griggs stared at him. Then, softly, hollowly, he asked, "Stop what?" And Voss felt something crack inside him. No one knows why they are here. The remaining crew staggered through the ship like sleepwalkers, wandering corridors that felt wrong, passing rooms that seemed older than they should be. At some point they stopped using names, because no one remembered them. Voss had to force himself to recall his own, whispering it under his breath, writing it on the wall of the bridge in greasy, shaking letters. But when he turned back, the writing was gone, as if the ship itself had simply decided to forget him too. Someone, a woman, maybe Reyes, maybe someone else, sat slumped in the mess hall, her eyes wide and unfocused. Voss crouched beside her. "Do you remember why we're here?" he asked. She blinked slowly, her breathing shallow. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "Were we always here?" Voss stood quickly, his skin crawling. He turned to Griggs, who was staring at the rusted floor, his lips moving soundlessly. Voss grabbed his shoulders. "Griggs, do you remember the mission?" Griggs just blanked. Then, after a long silence, What mission? Voss let go. He stepped back. His chest was tight. His lungs felt too small. The world unravels. The ship had been designed to withstand every environment imaginable. Now its hull peeled apart like old paper, its floors cracked, its walls crumbling. The corridors became unfamiliar. Rooms seemed to appear and disappear. The lower deck, the one they had spent days working in, was suddenly gone. There was no staircase leading down, no hatch, no sign it had ever existed. And worst of all, no one but Voss seemed to notice. The last moments of the Harbinger. Voss stood in the bridge, staring out at the flat, empty sea. The ocean was still. The world was quiet, but the ship was dying. The walls peeled away. The ceiling fractured, and for the first time, Voss saw the sky itself was wrong. There were no clouds, no moon, no stars, just a blank, featureless void stretching infinitely above them. Not dark, not black. Yes, empty. The last thought. Voss clenched his fists, his breath ragged. He turned back to Griggs, to the others. They were sitting silently, as if waiting for something. Their bodies were dull, colorless, fading, like photographs left too long in the sun. And Voss knew in his gut, in his bones, that this wasn't just the end of the mission. This wasn't just death. This was something worse. This was undoing. This was being erased. And soon, there would be nothing left. Not of the ship, not of the crew, not of the world that had existed before. The final realization. As the bridge began to dissolve, as the last echoes of the Harbinger peeled away into nothing, Voss took a final breath. He thought of the ocean, the abyss that had watched them, the thing that had never been a creature, the thing that had never truly woken up. And he realized in his last conscious moment that they had never found it. It had found them, and then there was nothing. Chapter 20. The Deep Does Not Remember. The ghost in the water. The FCS Harbinger should not have been found. It should have been gone, swallowed by the abyss, reduced to nothing but myth and whispers. A ship that was never real, never sailed, never existed. And yet, here it was, drifting, alone, a weathered corpse of steel and rust, caught in the slow-moving currents of the Pacific, discovered by a passing Foundation reconnaissance vessel, one that was not looking for it, one that did not even remember it had ever existed. The first recovery team boarded at dawn. By noon, they wished they hadn't. No crew, no names, no answers. The Harbinger was empty, not in the way a ship should be when it is abandoned, not in the way that suggested the crew had left. It was as if no one had ever been here at all. The bunks were untouched. No personal effects, no clothes, no signs of life. The ship's food supply was fully stocked, fresh, as if waiting for a crew that had never come. There was no dust, no decay, no mold creeping through the vents. The ship looked as if it had been paused in time, frozen, in the moment before something had erased it from history. The only sign that anything had happened at all was the condition of the walls, because the Harbinger was rotting. Its bulkheads were rusted, warped by centuries of exposure. Except it had not been gone for centuries. It had only been missing for 3 years. The locks are blank. The recovery team made their way to the bridge, their boots echoing too loudly in the dead, empty corridors. Every door opened easily, as if the ship had been expecting them. The bridge was silent. The captain's chair sat empty, surrounded by dead monitors, darkened screens reflecting a crew that was no longer there. Dr. Mercer, the lead investigator, sat at the main terminal. She tried to access the logs. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Then, a sharp beep. The screen flickered. TX recovery initiated. Mercer's heart pounded. For a moment she thought she had found something. Then the files loaded, and she felt her stomach drop. There is nothing here. The logs were empty. Every entry was blank. No timestamps, no messages. No missions briefings. No records of departure. There was no crew manifest. No sign that the Harbinger had ever been assigned personnel. No sign that the Harbinger had ever left port. No sign that the Harbinger had ever existed at all. Mercer's breathing shook. This was impossible. Every Foundation ship had a redundant encrypted logging system, fail-safes upon fail-safes, designed to prevent any possibility of data loss or corruption. Even if the logs had been manually deleted, there would have been traces, backups, metadata. But this was nothing. Not erased. Not corrupted. Never written in the first place. Mercer stared at the terminal, her skin crawling. The ship had been found, but its story was gone. The last message. Mercer leaned closer to the screen, her breath slow, measured. Then, the text shifted. The empty logs began to fill. One line, one message, written in real time, appearing letter by letter as if someone was typing it from nowhere. The deep does not remember. Mercer recoiled, her chair slamming backward against the steel floor. The team stared in horror. The words remained on the screen for 5 seconds. Then, they faded. Not deleted. Not erased. Just gone. Like they had never been written at all. The sea erases everything. The Harbinger was towed back to port. The Foundation debriefed the team. The ship was studied, scrubbed, picked apart. But there was nothing to learn. There were no records, no signs of a struggle, no fingerprints on the consoles, no DNA in the crew quarters. The Harbinger had no crew. It had never had a crew. At least, that's what the reports would say. That's what the logs would show. Because even now, the files were vanishing from the system. Because even now, the Foundation was forgetting that the Harbinger had ever gone missing. Because even now, the world was correcting itself. The ocean had decided, and when the ocean decides to forget something, it never existed at all.